They believed the Marines would break the moment their boots touched the lagoon. The Japanese officers on video were so confident in their defenses that they openly bragged about it. 1,000,000 Americans couldn't take Tarawa in 100 years. The payoff to that overconfidence is coming. But before we get there, staying with this story will show you exactly why one of the shortest battles of the Pacific became one of the bloodiest. And the opening minutes are the real reason. Minutes where everything the Marines trained for seemed to fall apart the second the sun rose over that tiny strip of coral. This isn't just another World War II story. It's a look inside a moment where preparation collided with chaos, where strategy met physics, and where thousands of lives hinged on the ocean doing something it refused to do. The tide was wrong. That was the first quiet disaster. Not dramatic, not explosive, just wrong. The landing plan depended on water deep enough for boats to cross the reef. Instead, the reef turned into a trap. Higgins' boats slammed into it, stopped dead, and Marines stared at the shoreline still hundreds of meters away. Every briefing back in Hawaii had repeated the same nightmare scenario. Getting stuck on the reef meant wading through waist-deep water while machine guns swept the lagoon. Watching this unfold from the boats, some Marines admitted they felt a second of disbelief, like someone had whispered the script of a worst-case scenario into their ear. LVTs were pushing forward, the only vehicles able to crawl over coral. They became the thin spearhead of the assault, forced to lead something they were never designed to lead. Every man inside could hear bullets rattling off the metal. Some held their breath each time a round punched through the thin armor, expecting the next one to hit fuel, or a face, or the driver. Officers kept shouting to keep eyes forward. Nobody wanted to look sideways and see how many boats were already drifting, burning, or turning into floating debris. If you're watching this and you want more deep, raw, no-nonsense World War II breakdowns like this one, it helps the channel a ton if you subscribe. You never have to, but if you end up feeling like this storytelling actually does these men justice, you'll know where the button is. The Japanese defenders watched the first wave struggle in the lagoon, and there was a brief moment where they genuinely thought the battle was already over. Machine gun nests that had survived the bombardment, most of them did, opened up on the water. The sound wasn't like normal fire. Veterans described it as a constant tearing, like the air itself was being shredded. Marines dropped into the water instantly. Others pushed forward, half running, half stumbling, rifles held above their heads, tasting salt and cordite every time they gasped for breath. Those who made it to the seawall threw themselves behind it and stayed there for long seconds, catching their breath, trying to understand what they had just survived. And there was another shock waiting for them. The bombardment everyone had relied on, hours of shells from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, had barely dented the Japanese fortifications. Pillboxes were intact. Trenches were untouched. Entire bunkers were sitting there, completely operational, their guns already adjusting to new angles. This wasn't supposed to happen. The American plan predicted fast collapse of Japanese positions once the naval guns did their job. Instead, the Marines were faced with an island that might as well have been untouched. That realization spread through the landing force like a cold wave. They were pinned down on a beach with no room to maneuver, under fire from angles nobody could even identify. Officers crawled along the seawall shouting orders. Radio men tried to call support, but antennas kept getting shot off. Marines asked each other where their squad leaders were, and half the time nobody answered. But this was the moment the Japanese had not planned for. Their entire defensive concept relied on breaking Marine morale early. These were supposed to be the minutes where Americans panicked, stalled, or retreated back into the lagoon. Instead, the opposite happened. The more the Marines realized how bad the situation was, the more determined they became to move forward. Staying in one place meant dying. Advancing at least offered a chance at breaking the Japanese firing lines. Small groups began pushing toward the gaps in the seawall, crawling over bodies, dragging wounded men with them. One Marine, pinned under a log, yelled for someone to cut him free. Another Marine grabbed a knife, slashed the strap on his pack, pulled him out, and kept moving. Nobody had a full picture of the battlefield. Smoke swirled everywhere. Sand kicked up with every explosion. Half the time, Marines couldn't tell if the man lying next to them was sleeping, unconscious, or worse. A group from the 2nd Division started advancing, toward one of the main bunkers on the right flank. They used a burned-out LVT as cover. The Japanese inside the bunker waited patiently until the Marines were halfway there, then opened fire with a burst that shredded the tractor like tinfoil. Men hit the ground instantly, crawling through sand that felt like it was boiling from the heat of the morning sun and the explosions. Another group tried to flank the same bunker, only to hit a trench they hadn't seen on aerial photos. The aerial photos had been right. The Japanese had just built more trenches after the photos were taken. That was another open loop in this battle. The Americans didn't know the true depth of the fortifications until they were physically on top of them. The first pushes inland were barely pushes at all, more like desperate lunges from one patch of cover to the next. The Marines used anything they could find: wrecked tractors, splintered palm logs, debris from the seawall, even the bodies of fallen comrades. Every inch forward felt like a gamble. One step too far to the right, and you were exposed to a machine gun nest that hadn't revealed itself yet. One step too far left, and you were in the line of sight of a bunker nobody had managed to silence. Tarawa wasn't a wide battlefield with shifting fronts. It was a tight, suffocating grid of killing zones where every decision had to be made in seconds. Some Marines didn't wait for orders. They just saw opportunities and took them. A corporal sprinted across open ground with a satchel charge, dove behind a log, tried to catch his breath, then kept crawling toward the bunker that had cut down the men in the lagoon minutes earlier. Another Marine followed with a flamethrower, the tank on his back making him a giant target. Japanese gunners focused on him instantly, and rounds sparked off the metal tank. He hit the sand, flattened himself, then pushed forward again. These were movements nobody back home would ever fully understand. Tiny, violent chess moves made in seconds. Inside the bunkers, the Japanese were still convinced the momentum was theirs. They heard the screams from the water. They saw Marines pinned to the seawall. They believed their overlapping fields of fire would crush the landing entirely. But they began to notice something disturbing. Every time they thought a position had been cleared of Americans, another cluster of Marines appeared, crawling forward, throwing grenades, firing from angles the defenders hadn't expected. The Japanese had built Tarawa to be a fortress. They didn't expect an enemy who treated every inch of that fortress like an invitation. A group of Marines finally reached the first major bunker on the western side. They were exhausted, bleeding, covered in salt water and sand that stuck to their skin like glue. The corporal with the satchel charge got close enough to toss it under the firing slit. The explosion shook the structure, but didn't collapse it. That was the second harsh lesson of the day. Japanese bunkers on Tarawa were not flimsy. They were layered with coconut logs, sand, concrete, and coral. Some Marines swore they were basically hitting caves. The flamethrower operator moved in next. He stepped out from behind the debris, crouched low, and let out a burst of fire that lit up the entire front of the bunker. Screams from inside, mixed with the roar of burning fuel. The Marines didn't wait for silence. They rushed forward, climbed on top, and began firing down into the ventilation holes. There was no room for hesitation. The faster a position was neutralized, the fewer casualties the rest of the assault would take. Clearing that one bunker didn't feel like progress. It felt like surviving one task before being shoved into the next. The Marines were surrounded by structures identical to the one they'd just taken, and every single one of them was occupied by defenders who had prepared for this exact scenario. Marines kept crawling east and west along the seawall, blowing holes through it, creating new lanes, trying to link up with units who might or might not still be alive. Somewhere behind all the noise, naval gunfire returned. The ships offshore realized that the Japanese had survived the initial bombardment, and they began firing again, trying to soften up positions the Marines marked with signal panels. The problem was timing. Every time a signal panel went up, the Japanese fired at the Marine holding it. Every attempt to reorganize drew incoming fire. The beach was a chaotic mix of shouted orders, confused radio calls, and Marines acting on instincts because nothing else felt fast enough. The Japanese commander, Shibasaki, was monitoring everything. Reports reached him saying Americans were pinned down and suffering massive casualties. That part was true. Reports also said the Americans were failing to push inland. That part was false. Small groups of Marines were already breaking through weak spots in the line, using smoke, grenades, and sheer aggression to reach trenches the Japanese thought were inaccessible. Shibasaki expected the Americans to lose heart after the initial carnage. Instead, they became more relentless. Marines who made it inland began discovering how dense the defenses really were. Trenches zigzagged everywhere. Pillboxes were linked. Machine gun nests had backup positions. And deeper tunnels allowed defenders to retreat, reappear, counterattack, then disappear again. The entire island felt alive, like it was shifting under their feet. One squad pushed toward the airfield, a flat stretch in the island center. They expected open ground. Instead, they found themselves facing a row of concealed positions built into the ruins of Japanese structures. Every step forward felt like poking a hole into a hornet's nest. One Marine threw a grenade into a trench, then jumped in right after it, knowing hesitation meant giving defenders time to re-engage. Another Marine grabbed a Browning automatic rifle and laid down suppressive fire, while two others crawled toward a bunker's blind spot. This wasn't textbook amphibious warfare anymore. This was improvisation under fire. Marines used Japanese grenades when they ran out of their own. They dragged wounded men behind smashed drums and piles of sandbags. They used rifles from fallen comrades when their own jammed from seawater. Every few minutes, someone yelled an update, sometimes accurate, sometimes not. Units were so mixed that squads temporarily merged into ad hoc teams of men who had never met before. And throughout all of this, one brutal truth became clearer with each bunker they passed. The Japanese weren't falling back. They weren't preparing to retreat. They were preparing to die where they stood. Marines learned this the hard way when they cleared a trench only to have defenders charge back into it minutes later from a tunnel entrance nobody had seen. A firefight broke out at a distance of only a few feet. Marines fired point blank. Knives came out. Rifle butts swung. It was raw, close-quarters combat that left everyone shaken. But the Marines didn't break. What the Japanese hadn't expected was that the same stubbornness they counted on exploiting would become the thing that destroyed them. The Marines kept pushing, inch by inch, bunker by bunker, trench by trench. They weren't fighting for ground. They were fighting for survival. And in battles like that, giving up simply wasn't an option. Bodies lay everywhere along the seawall, Japanese and American, and Marines kept stepping over them because stopping meant becoming one of them. The sand had turned into a mixture of blood, ash, shell fragments, and seawater that made every crawl and every push feel heavier than the last. Some Marines realized they hadn't blinked in minutes. Others noticed their hands shaking only when they paused to reload. Tarawa forced every sense into overdrive. Every pop sounded like a sniper, every shadow like a bunker slit, every gust of hot wind like incoming fire. More Marines finally reached the inland side of the seawall and began fanning out. Their goal wasn't to take the island, yet. It was much more basic: create enough space for the rest of the waves still stuck out in the lagoon. The longer the lagoon stayed a kill zone, the more casualties kept piling up. The first wave was fighting not only for themselves, but for thousands of Marines who still had to cross the same open stretch of water. A group of Marines found a cluster of Japanese trenches angled toward the lagoon, machine guns still firing on Marines wading in. They didn't wait for orders. They crawled as close as they could, flanked the trench, and dropped grenades in without hesitation. The explosions didn't silence the guns completely, so they pushed in, clearing the trench one section at a time. Those few minutes of action saved dozens of Marines crossing behind them. The Japanese counterattacked almost immediately. Shouting erupted from a nearby tunnel entrance as a squad of defenders burst out, charging with bayonets. Marines fired so fast that rifles jammed from the heat. When the shooting stopped, the counterattack had been wiped out, but it was a reminder that nothing on Tarawa stayed secure for long. You cleared a position, and 5 minutes later something came at you from a direction you didn't know existed. Radio operators from the 2nd Division finally managed to set up a working line to the offshore ships. They requested precision fire on specific bunkers that had survived the initial bombardment. The problem was accuracy. The island was so small that naval shells hitting even a few yards off target could take out Marines as easily as Japanese. Marines marked targets with panels, and Japanese shot at those panels instantly. Still, some calls went through. A destroyer offshore adjusted its guns and fired a series of shells, so close that Marines felt their teeth rattle. Those shells collapsed a bunker that the airfield in the center of the island came into view for the first time. It wasn't the clear, open strip Marines expected. Wrecked Japanese planes littered the ground. Barbed wire crisscrossed sections of it. Trenches and firing pits ringed the perimeter. Even the airfield had been turned into a fortress. Marines trying to move across it had to crawl between pieces of fuselage and burnt-out vehicles, all while avoiding snipers hidden in half-collapsed shelters. One Marine squad reached a Japanese command post disguised as a simple storage hut. They blew the door off with a charge and found maps, ammunition crates, and documents spread across the floor. They didn't have time to examine anything. A burst of gunfire tore through the wall from the outside, forcing them to dive out the back and regroup. Even when they found something strategically valuable, the battle never paused long enough to process it. Smoke drifted across the airfield in thick yellow clouds. Some of it came from burning fuel. Some came from flamethrowers. Some came from bodies. Marines wiped sweat out of their eyes with sandy hands, making their vision blur. The heat was suffocating. Even though the battle had only been going on for hours, it felt like days. The sun kept rising, making the lagoon shimmer like polished metal, and every minute exposed more of the battlefield to enemy optics. A squad pushing toward the eastern end of the island found a Japanese anti-aircraft gun still operational. It had been used during the initial bombardment to fire at naval planes. Now, the Japanese turned it horizontally and tried to use it as a giant machine gun against ground targets. Every blast kicked up a shower of coral fragments. Marines hugged the ground and crawled forward. A bar gunner fired short, controlled bursts until the Japanese crew ducked behind the shield. A flamethrower operator sprinted forward, flames trailing behind him, and let loose a burst that washed over the entire gun pit, silencing it. The Japanese still believed the Marines would crack if they pushed hard enough. They launched small counterattacks from tunnels and spider holes, sometimes at point-blank range. One Marine was crawling past a palm stump when a Japanese soldier burst from a hole right beside it, swinging a knife. The Marine dropped his rifle, grabbed the man's wrist, and the two rolled in the sand until another Marine shot the attacker off him. These moments were so sudden and so intimate that some Marines later said they remembered the exact sound of breath from the man they fought. Officers struggled to maintain any sense of formation. Units were mixed together in every direction. Leaders improvised on the fly, grouping whoever was nearby into functional teams. Some men followed sergeants who weren't from their company. Others teamed up with strangers because they were the only people within shouting distance. On Tarawa, rank mattered less than whoever had the clearest view of what was in front of them. A major finally managed to organize a push toward the central Japanese strongpoint, a huge network of bunkers near the southern shore. This was the heart of Shibasaki's defenses. The Japanese knew if these positions fell, the island would eventually fall with them. They defended it like it was the last piece of ground on Earth. Machine guns, mortar pits, command bunkers, tunnels. It was all intertwined. The Marines advancing on it felt like they were fighting into the mouth of something alive. They moved slowly, using smoke grenades and crawls to get angles on firing slits. They threw satchel charges into ventilation shafts. They coordinated with naval gunfire when they could, even though the risk of friendly fire hung over every call. Every few minutes, a Japanese defender would pop out of a tunnel and fire a burst before disappearing again. The only way to stop them was to find the tunnel entrances and collapse them, one by one. By late morning, Marines had carved out a thin strip of control stretching from the western landing point toward the island center. It wasn't secure. It wasn't stable, but it was the first hint of momentum. And the Japanese finally began to realize something they had not expected at all. The Marines were not going to back down, not even after suffering some of the worst opening hour casualties of the Pacific War. Marines finally had enough men on the beach to mount coordinated pushes, but coordination didn't mean clarity. Every direction looked hostile. Every pile of debris hit a firing slit or a tunnel entrance. Some Marines climbed onto shattered Japanese positions only to discover that the real bunker entrance was behind them, and defenders were still inside, waiting. Others charged into trenches expecting enemies and found nothing, only for fire to erupt from a completely different angle seconds later. Tarawa twisted every expectation. A group pushing east reached a series of interlocked pillboxes that dominated the center of the island. These weren't simple concrete blocks. They had overlapping arcs of fire, making it nearly impossible to approach without being exposed. The Marines tried a frontal assault first and were immediately pinned down. They backed off, regrouped, and decided to flank. That approach led them straight into a trench full of Japanese soldiers who had been waiting silently for the first group to fail. The trench erupted into close-quarters chaos. Rifles fired so close their muzzles almost touched uniforms. A Marine jabbed with a bayonet and felt resistance like stabbing into a sack of wet sand. Someone shouted for grenades. They rolled into depressions and hollows, their explosions sending clumps of dirt and coral raining down. A Japanese soldier lunged out of a side tunnel with a sword and was dropped by a Marine who didn't even remember pulling the trigger. The trench became a blur of movement, sound, and instinct. When it quieted, the Marines pushed on, not because they were sure of the route, but because standing still on Tarawa was the fastest way to die. Every bunker required a different approach. One had to be taken from the roof. Another had a hidden back entrance that needed to be sealed with an explosive. Another was too thick to breach, so Marines used flamethrowers to force the defenders out. Each success felt temporary, like it bought only a few more yards of ground before the next challenge appeared. The Japanese began concentrating mortar fire on the captured sections of the beach. Marines scrambled to spread out as rounds fell around them, turning sand into glassy shards. One shell landed inside an abandoned Japanese position, sending a spray of shrapnel across a dozen men. A corpseman crawled through the smoke, sliding across bodies, trying to stop bleeding with hands already soaked in someone else's blood. He didn't have enough bandages. He ripped cloth from a dead Marine's uniform and used it instead. More Marines kept landing in the lagoon as the waves progressed, but the reef was still a nightmare. Boats continued running aground. Men still had to wade in. Some Marines reached the seawall with bullet holes in their canteens, others with holes in their helmets. One Marine collapsed behind the wall and stared at the dent in the front of his steel pod, realizing the round had stopped inches from his skull. He didn't celebrate. He just threw the helmet back on and kept moving. By midday, the number of operable flamethrowers on the island was dropping fast. Fuel tanks were exploding when hit. Operators were being targeted immediately, but the remaining teams knew they were essential. Tarawa couldn't be taken without them. A flamethrower crew advanced toward a major bunker, blocking the path inland. They waited for machine gun fire to shift for a split second, then sprinted across open ground. Bullets snapped past them in streams. The operator hit the sand, rolled forward, and unleashed a jet of fire that wrapped around the bunker's entrance. The heat was so intense that Marines 50 feet away felt it on their faces. The screams inside didn't last long. The bunker wasn't entirely cleared, though. Marines pried open a side panel and found a tunnel leading deeper under the structure. They tossed explosives into it and jumped back as the concussion shook the ground. When the smoke settled, the tunnel had collapsed. It was one of dozens that had to be sealed before the Japanese network stopped spitting out counterattacks. Shibasaki was receiving updates from surviving command posts. Every report insisted the Americans were still trapped near the beach, still losing men, still struggling to move inland. But he began hearing conflicting information. Sightings of Marines near the airfield, Marines approaching the central bunkers, Marines flanking positions that shouldn't have been flanked. His communications officers warned him the enemy was advancing faster than expected. He dismissed some reports as exaggerations. Others he simply didn't believe. He had built Tarawa to be impregnable. The Americans shouldn't have been inside the defensive perimeter this early. As Marines crawled closer to the heart of the island, they encountered a massive Japanese fortification nicknamed the Command Bunker. It dominated the center and controlled several trenches radiating outward. Machine guns from this position raked the airfield and cut across approaches from both the west and south. It was impossible to bypass. A group from the 1st Battalion tried to approach from the east. Every time someone moved, fire erupted from the firing slit. Marines tried tossing grenades, but the slit was too small. A demolition team crawled forward with explosives, but was forced back by concentrated fire. The bunker seemed invincible. One Marine joked that it looked like somebody had buried a battleship turret in the sand. The solution came from a mix of desperation and creativity. A Marine spotted an old Japanese cart left near a pile of debris. He and two others dragged it into position, ducking gunfire. They loaded it with satchel charges, tied the fuses together, and prepared to push it toward the bunker. The moment they stood up to shove the cart forward, bullets tore into the sand around them. One Marine took a round through the arm, but kept pushing. The cart rolled across open ground, wobbling on one wheel, until it reached the bunker's base. The men dove flat. A second later, the explosion tore a hole through the bunker's side big enough for a man to crawl through. Marines rushed in immediately. They cleared the interior with short, brutal bursts of fire. When the bunker fell silent, they radioed back that the position was neutralized. It was the first major Japanese strongpoint to collapse that day. The fall of that bunker shifted the momentum. Marines finally had a foothold deep enough to bring heavy weapons ashore. Machine guns, mortars, and even small pack howitzers were dragged forward through sand so hot it blistered exposed skin. These weapons were set up behind whatever cover existed, and Marines began returning fire with something more than rifles and grenades. The Japanese tried one more sweeping counterattack, this time launching it from a cluster of trenches near the southern edge. They charged in tight formations, shouting as they moved, hoping to overwhelm the thin Marine line. But by now, American machine guns were in place. Marines opened fire with overlapping fields that mirrored the Japanese defenses. The counterattack broke apart within seconds. Bodies fell in rows. The charge didn't reach the U.S. lines. The defenders realized something they hadn't admitted even to themselves. The Marines weren't leaving. They weren't hesitating. They weren't losing momentum. With every bunker that fell, with every trench that got cleared, the Japanese option shrank. The island they believed would hold for 100 years was shrinking hour by hour. Marines pressed deeper into the island, but the ground they were fighting on barely felt like ground at all. It was a maze, trenches looping into bunkers, bunkers feeding into tunnels, tunnels branching into firing pits that weren't on any map. Every time they thought they had reached a solid line, the earth would open up again and spill defenders into their flank. The entire place felt like it had been designed to punish hesitation. Men who paused for even 2 seconds found tracer rounds stitching the sand beside them. Nobody dared lift their head higher than a few inches. A squad moving along the airfield's northern edge found themselves pinned behind engine blocks from wrecked planes. The incoming fire was so heavy they couldn't even look toward the shooters. Bullets cracked inches above their helmets, and the heat made the metal they hid behind too hot to touch. A lieutenant belly crawled forward to get a better angle, spotting a long trench that curved like a horseshoe. Every few seconds, a muzzle flash lit up inside it. He pulled back, pointed the position out to his men, and they began tossing grenades in an arc they hoped was wide enough. The blast shook the trench, but didn't silence it. They would have to get closer. 2 Marines volunteered to crawl up the side, using the wreckage for cover. They moved inch by inch until they reached a shallow ditch that led directly to the trench. When gunfire shifted elsewhere for a split second, they pushed forward, rolled over the lip, and emptied their rifles point blank into the defenders. By the time the rest of the squad reached them, the trench was theirs. Gains like this looked tiny on a map, but on Tarawa, they were everything. The airfield was now half controlled, but visibility was low. Smoke drifted across the open space in waves. Some of it was from burning fuel dumps, some from smoldering palm logs, some from flamethrowers sweeping bunkers that wouldn't collapse. Marines squinted through the haze, accidentally shooting at shadows more than once. This smoke worked both ways, though. The Japanese couldn't see clearly either. Their gunners fired at shapes, movement, or pure instinct. A team of engineers reached the remnants of a large Japanese fuel tank. It had been hit earlier by naval fire, leaving a smoldering crater and the twisted shell of the tank. The engineers realized they could use the crater as a staging position to launch a push toward the island's central command area. They signaled back to officers, and more men crawled forward to join them. It was still suicide to stand upright, but the crater gave them a rare pocket of safety. Inside the crater, Marines talked in short, clipped sentences. Nobody wasted breath. One man adjusted his helmet, only to notice it had been dented twice on the back from glancing rounds he never felt. Another Marine realized he had been carrying an empty magazine for 20 minutes. He laughed once under his breath, then went silent again. They waited for a break in fire, and when it came, they surged out of the crater and ran across open ground toward the central command bunker. Everything in front of them was blackened. Trees blasted to splinters, sand churned into pits. They dove behind whatever debris still existed, bullets ripping the air above them. A mortar shell landed 20 yards away, tossing sand into their faces. They wiped their eyes and kept crawling. The command bunker was massive, protected by thick layers of log and coral. Machine guns covered every angle. Marines tried approaching from the east and were driven back. They tried the north and were pinned down by crossfire. Someone suggested pulling back to call for naval fire, but it was too risky. This bunker was too close to the advancing Marines. A shell a few yards off target would wipe out half the assault team. A young sergeant made the call. They would breach it up close. The squad formed a line, leapfrogging from crater to crater. They pinned down the firing slit with rifle fire, giving 2 Marines enough time to sprint forward with satchel charges. One made it to the outer wall. The other took a hit to the leg and collapsed in the sand. The sergeant crawled to him, grabbed the charge from his limp hand, and kept moving. Bullets snapped past his elbows as he slid the charge under the bunker's log wall. He scrambled backward. The explosion lifted part of the wall off its foundation, but only slightly. The bunker didn't collapse. It just sagged ominously. The Marines didn't care. They swarmed the gap, firing through every crack, pouring grenades into the opening. Screams came from inside. Machine gun fire sputtered, then stopped completely. The Marines moved in, guns raised, and cleared the interior room by room. They found Japanese officers inside, some still clutching swords, others lying across maps and radio sets. This was one of the island's command nodes. Taking it shifted the entire battlefield. Back near the lagoon, more Marines were finally making it ashore. The fire hitting the water had slackened, just enough that men weren't dying in rows anymore. As these reinforcements reached the seawall, they immediately joined the fight inland. Some hadn't even found their own units yet. They simply followed the nearest Marines who were moving. Tarawa didn't allow time for sorting things out. The enemy was in front of them, and that was enough. The 8th Marines pushed north toward a cluster of palm stumps where defenders had holed up. The trunks were shattered but still tall enough to hide machine gun teams. The Marines fired into the gaps between the stumps, then rushed forward in a line, tossing grenades into every shadow. When they reached the stumps, they found Japanese soldiers wedged between roots, some alive, some dead, some clutching rifles they never had time to fire. Further west, a flamethrower team advanced toward a bunker that had stalled progress for almost an hour. The operator ignited his weapon and sent a long tongue of fire through the firing slit. The bunker lit up instantly, flames shooting out from the top vent. Marines waited until the screams faded, then approached, ready for anything. A single surviving defender burst out with a bayonet and was shot immediately. By mid-afternoon, the Marines had formed a jagged, uneven front line across the island. It wasn't secure, but it was holding. Japanese positions were collapsing one by one. Their counterattacks were smaller. Their fire was less coordinated. The defenders who were still alive were desperate, exhausted, running out of ammunition, and trapped on an island too small to maneuver on. The Marines noticed a shift. The air felt different. Not safer, but less hopeless. Fire still came from unexpected corners, but the intensity had dropped. It meant one thing. The Japanese were fighting to the last man, and there were fewer men left. The sun dropped lower, turning the battlefield into a furnace. Heat radiated from burning bunkers, from the dark coral sand, from the metal wreckage scattered everywhere. Marines wiped sweat from their eyes with hands coated in grit. Every breath tasted like smoke and salt. Nobody knew how many hours had passed since the landing. Time didn't move normally on Tarawa. Minutes felt like whole campaigns. Hours felt like entire wars. The line pushed forward again, not in wide sweeping movements, but in jagged bursts. A bunker collapsing here, a trench cleared there, a tunnel sealed under a pile of explosives. Progress on Tarawa was measured in yards, sometimes feet, sometimes just the distance between 2 shattered palm stalks. But every gain pushed the Japanese further into the shrinking center of the island. A group of Marines approached a ridge of coral rubble that gave the defenders a commanding angle over the airfield. The Japanese had been using this natural rise as a firing platform since dawn. Anyone on the American side who tried to cross the open ground in front of it had been cut down. Marines finally managed to circle around the left flank, crawling on hands and knees to avoid detection. One man moved too fast and kicked a piece of debris. The clatter echoed. A burst of fire tore into the rubble above them, showering them with splinters and stone. The squad froze. The Japanese kept firing at the noise, but didn't adjust their aim enough to see the flanking movement. When the gunfire shifted just a degree too far right, the Marines took their chance. They leaped forward, tossing grenades in a wide arc. Explosions rocked the crest. The Marines charged up the slope, rifles ready, and caught the defenders mid-reload. The firefight lasted seconds. When it ended, the ridge was theirs. The airfield was almost entirely under Marine control now, and that changed the rhythm of the battle. For the first time, Marines could move without having to crawl every inch. They still couldn't stand fully upright. Snipers were watching, but they could crouch walk from cover to cover, pushing deeper toward the last cluster of major Japanese positions on the southern end of the island. Japanese defenders, dug into a dense network of trenches near the southern coast, continued firing even when they knew they were surrounded. Many had been ordered by Shibasaki himself to die in place. They didn't know that Shibasaki had already been killed, crushed by naval shelling earlier in the day. His death had cut off coordinated command. Defenders were acting on habit now, not strategy. A Marine platoon pushing through the southern trenches encountered some of the most desperate fighting of the entire battle. These trenches were narrow, winding, packed with debris and bodies. Some were barely wide enough for two men to pass each other. Marines fired into shadows, expecting movement at every turn. Japanese soldiers popped out of hidden recesses, swinging bayonets or firing pistols at point-blank range. Marines responded instantly, instinct overpowering fear. Fire, reload, move, shove forward. One Marine clubbed a Japanese defender with the stock of his rifle after his weapon jammed from sand. Another Marine used his helmet as a shield while crawling under a low section of trench, bullets clanging off the steel as he squeezed through. Two other Marines found themselves face-to-face with a defender who had been pretending to be dead. He sprang up with a grenade, but they shot him before he could pull the pin fully. Every few minutes, someone shouted a warning. Grenade. Marines hit the deck. Dirt rained down. One grenade didn't explode. Another rolled into a puddle and blew the water skyward. The trenches echoed with chaos. A flamethrower team joined the push, clearing out junctions too dangerous to approach directly. Flames roared down the tunnels, illuminating wooden support beams, turning the air into a pulsing orange glow. Some defenders ran from the fire and into the open, where Marines cut them down. Others stayed inside, fighting until the heat overwhelmed them. The Marines were pushing the defenders into a smaller and smaller pocket, compressing them against the final set of fortifications. Massive, reinforced bunkers near the southern tip. These bunkers were monstrous structures, layered with coconut logs, sand, and concrete. They were practically immune to rifle fire. Marines fired at every crack anyway, hoping to force mistakes. They tossed explosives through vent holes. They advanced under cover of smoke that swirled like ghosts across the battlefield. As they approached the largest bunker, the ground shook. A naval shell, fired from a destroyer offshore, hit the bunker's roof dead on. The explosion sent a shockwave across the battlefield, so powerful that Marines dropped to their knees. A section of the roof collapsed inward, opening a jagged hole. Marines didn't hesitate. They rushed forward, leaping over debris, firing into the darkness. The defenders inside tried to fall back deeper into the structure, but there was nowhere left to go. One by one, these final bunkers fell. The defenders fought until the last breath, some refusing to surrender, even when they were wounded beyond fighting capability. The Marines respected the tenacity, but didn't slow down. Tarawa had taught them a brutal truth. Hesitation got people killed. By late afternoon, the island had gone eerily quiet in places. Not everywhere. Pockets of resistance still flashed with gunfire, but the constant roar of battle had softened. Marines noticed they could finally hear their own thoughts again, though few wanted to tune into them. Groups of Marines pushed deeper into the southern tip, clearing trenches, rooting out snipers hiding in pits covered with foliage. A sniper took a shot from a palm stump and was dropped by a Marine who reacted faster than he realized. Another defender tried to run from a tunnel entrance, firing a pistol wildly. He fell after 3 Marines opened up simultaneously. The island was shrinking. The defenders were surrounded. The Marines were closing in from every direction. Night was approaching, and everyone knew the Japanese often launched suicidal banzai charges after dark. Marines reinforced their lines, dug into shallow depressions, cleaned weapons, shared ammunition. They were filthy, sunburned, and exhausted, but alert. And somewhere in the dwindling Japanese stronghold, the surviving defenders were silently preparing to die. Night fell over BDO like a lid being closed on a boiling pot. The heat didn't disappear. It just settled into the sand, into the air, into the Marine's skin. Darkness didn't bring relief. It brought tension. Every Marine on the line understood what usually came after sunset in Pacific Island battles: a banzai attack. A full force, all-or-nothing charge meant to overwhelm positions with shock, noise, and sheer numbers. The Japanese had launched them on Guadalcanal, on Tulagi, on numerous smaller islands. And with the defenders on Tarawa now trapped in a shrinking pocket, the expectation was that they would make one final, violent push. Historically, the defenders on Tarawa did launch attacks at night, but they weren't the massive banzai waves Marines had seen elsewhere. Tarawa's garrison consisted mostly of trained Special Naval Landing Force troops, the elite Rikusentai. They fought differently. Instead of large charges, they used infiltration, crawling, sneaking, slipping through gaps, appearing suddenly in the dark with grenades and bayonets. It created a night not of one big charge, but of dozens of small, terrifying encounters. As the sky darkened, Marines tightened their lines along the airfield and the southern trenches. They grouped machine guns to cover likely approaches. Riflemen dug shallow fighting holes. Flamethrowers were placed behind them, ready to respond if attackers breached the outer line. Mortar crews were told to keep illumination rounds ready, parachute flares that could turn night into a blinding white moment for a few critical seconds. A faint rustling began near a stand of shattered palms. Marines gripped their rifles and watched. The rustling stopped. Then it started again, but from a different direction. One Marine whispered that he saw movement. Another said it was just wind. A third hissed at both of them to shut up. The first infiltrators came crawling on their stomachs, using the darkness and debris for cover. They tossed grenades before firing, hoping the explosions would disorient the Marines long enough to rush the line. A grenade landed 2 feet from a Marine and bounced into a crater before exploding. He felt the shock wave rise through the sand into his chest. He fired back blindly toward the movement. A Japanese soldier leapt from behind a log, charging a Marine foxhole with a bayonet. The Marine inside fired twice, the flashes lighting up his own face in the dark. The attacker fell forward into the hole, landing on top of him. The Marine shoved the body aside and kept his rifle trained outward. Another group of defenders slipped through a gap on the western flank, cutting into the rear of a machine gun position. They killed one gunner instantly before the assistant gunner turned the weapon sideways and fired at point-blank range. The recoil nearly tore the gun from his hands, but the infiltrators dropped in front of him. He shouted for help, and 2 nearby Marines rushed in to reinforce the position. In one part of the line, a Japanese soldier crawled so close to a Marine foxhole that the Marine didn't notice him until the man tried to pull the pin on a grenade. The Marine grabbed his wrist, twisted hard, and the grenade fell harmlessly into the sand. The Japanese soldier lunged with a knife, but another Marine shot him from the side. Tarawa's night wasn't one battle. It was dozens of individual duels fought in darkness, so thick hearing mattered more than sight. Marines relied on instinct and proximity. Many said later they fired at sound more than silhouette, and that the smell of cordite, sweat, and burning wood became the only constant sensory anchor. Every flare that burst overhead froze the battlefield in stark white light. Marines saw forms crawling toward them, shapes shifting among debris, the glint of bayonets, the shadow of Japanese helmets. They fired until the flare burned out, plunging everything back into blackness. Around midnight, The attacks intensified. Groups of Japanese defenders sprinted forward in twos and threes, hurling grenades, then charging behind them. Some reached the Marine lines and fought hand-to-hand. A Marine sergeant found himself grappling with a Japanese soldier who had tackled him from behind. They rolled into a shallow depression, wrestling for control of a rifle. The sergeant finally bit down on the attacker's forearm, forcing him to recoil long enough for the sergeant to yank a knife from his belt and end the fight. They waited for a break in fire, and when it came, they surged out of the crater and ran across open ground toward the central command bunker. Everything in front of them was blackened. Trees blasted to splinters, sand churned into pits. They dove behind whatever debris still existed, bullets ripping the air above them. A mortar shell landed 20 yards away, tossing sand into their faces. They wiped their eyes and kept crawling. The command bunker was massive, protected by thick layers of log and coral. Machine guns covered every angle. Marines tried approaching from the east and were driven back. They tried the north and were pinned down by crossfire. Someone suggested pulling back to call for naval fire, but it was too risky. This bunker was too close to the advancing Marines. A shell a few yards off target would wipe out half the assault team. A young sergeant made the call. They would breach it up close. The squad formed a line, leapfrogging from crater to crater. They pinned down the firing slit with rifle fire, giving 2 Marines enough time to sprint forward with satchel charges. One made it to the outer wall. The other took a hit to the leg and collapsed in the sand. The sergeant crawled to him, grabbed the charge from his limp hand, and kept moving. Bullets snapped past his elbows as he slid the charge under the bunker's log wall. He scrambled backward. The explosion lifted part of the wall off its foundation, but only slightly. The bunker didn't collapse. It just sagged ominously. The Marines didn't care. They swarmed the gap, firing through every crack, pouring grenades into the opening. Screams came from inside. Machine gun fire sputtered, then stopped completely. The Marines moved in, guns raised, and cleared the interior room by room. They found Japanese officers inside, some still clutching swords, others lying across maps and radio sets. This was one of the island's command nodes. Taking it shifted the entire battlefield. Back near the lagoon, more Marines were finally making it ashore. The fire hitting the water had slackened just enough that men weren't dying in rows anymore. As these reinforcements reached the seawall, they immediately joined the fight inland. Some hadn't even found their own units yet. They simply followed the nearest Marines who were moving. Tarawa didn't allow time for sorting things out. The enemy was in front of them, and that was enough. The 8th Marines pushed north toward a cluster of palm stumps where defenders had holed up. The trunks were shattered but still tall enough to hide machine gun teams. The Marines fired into the gaps between the stumps, then rushed forward in a line, tossing grenades into every shadow. When they reached the stumps, they found Japanese soldiers wedged between roots, some alive, some dead, some clutching rifles they never had time to fire. Further west, a flamethrower team advanced toward a bunker that had stalled progress for almost an hour. The operator ignited his weapon and sent a long tongue of fire through the firing slit. The bunker lit up instantly, flames shooting out from the top vent. Marines waited until the screams faded, then approached, ready for anything. A single surviving defender burst out with a bayonet and was shot immediately. By mid-afternoon, the Marines had formed a jagged, uneven front line across the island. It wasn't secure, but it was holding. Japanese positions were collapsing one by one. Their counterattacks were smaller. Their fire was less coordinated. The defenders who were still alive were desperate, exhausted, running out of ammunition, and trapped on an island too small to maneuver on. The Marines noticed a shift. The air felt different, not safer, but less hopeless. Fire still came from unexpected corners, but the intensity had dropped. It meant one thing. The Japanese were fighting to the last man, and there were fewer men left. In the months after the battle, the survivors carried Tarawa with them in ways they didn't speak about immediately. Some wrote home, describing what they could manage without frightening their families. Others avoided details entirely. A few sent letters for the families of friends who had fallen. Careful, thoughtful letters, written slowly in the corners of crowded ships, trying to put into words something that didn't really have language. Most of them struggled to explain the feeling of stepping off BDO for the last time. The island looked small from the deck of a transport ship. Tiny. Insignificant. From a distance, it didn't look like a place where nearly 6,000 men had died in 76 hours. It looked like nothing. Just a strip of coral surrounded by blue water. But every Marine who stared back at it knew the truth. Small places can change the direction of a whole war. Tarawa forced the U.S. to rethink everything about amphibious warfare. It wasn't a slow evolution. It was a shock treatment. The lessons were written in blood, but they were learned. When the Marines hit Kwajalein, Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu, and eventually Iwo Jima, the assaults were shaped by everything that had gone wrong at Tarawa: better intelligence, better timing, better bombardment, better vehicles, better coordination. And that's part of the reason the Tarawa veterans said later that their suffering wasn't wasted. They hated what happened, but they accepted its role. One Marine described it simply: "We died so others didn't have to." The Japanese survivors were transferred to prison camps. Most stayed silent. A few spoke about Shibasaki's confidence, about how certain they had been that Tarawa was impossible to take. None of them had imagined the Marines would keep coming through such slaughter. None expected Americans to cross the lagoon under machine gun fire that should have erased entire battalions. If they had known how many Marines were willing to crawl, swim, and claw their way ashore no matter the cost, some admitted privately they might have prepared differently. But that honesty only came years later. BDO itself was cleaned, rebuilt, and turned into a functioning airfield that became critical in the Marshals Campaign. Pilots flying from its runway had no idea that the sand beneath their wheels covered mass graves, collapsed bunkers, and tunnels filled with the last defenders. The war didn't wait for the island to heal. It simply used it and moved on. But time didn't bury Tarawa completely. Decades later, storms shifted the sand. Construction projects uncovered bones. Families who had never received closure finally had their sons, fathers, and brothers identified and brought home thanks to modern DNA testing. Coffins draped in flags arrived at airports across the United States, welcomed by Marines in dress blues standing silently at attention. Some families had waited 70 years for that moment. Others still wait. Historians who study Tarawa often say the battle represents a collision between absolute preparation and absolute will. The Japanese had built defenses that should have been impenetrable. The Marines faced conditions that should have shattered any assault. The island itself betrayed them at the reef, the tide refusing to rise. And yet the Marines adapted, endured, and kept going. It wasn't cleaner or more heroic than any movie would show. It was dirt, fear, confusion, bravery in seconds-long bursts, and a determination that defied logic. That's why Tarawa remains one of the defining battles of the Marine Corps. It isn't remembered for its size. It was tiny. It isn't remembered for its duration. It was short. It's remembered because the men who fought there had every reason to fail and didn't. They were told the island was a fortress. They were told the defenses were too strong. They were told an assault in daylight would be catastrophic. And when all of that proved true in the worst possible ways, they still pushed forward until the last bunker fell silent. After the war, when veterans were asked what mattered most about Tarawa, they didn't talk about strategy or doctrine. They talked about the Marines beside them, the ones who carried satchel charges forward through open fire, the ones who dragged wounded men through waist-deep water, the ones who didn't hesitate when they heard a shout for help, the ones who didn't come home. Those names filled entire columns in newspapers back home. Small towns across the country added new gold stars to windows. Mothers and fathers read telegrams in kitchens that suddenly felt too quiet. Tarawa rippled outward across the United States in a way few battles ever had. It hurt. It changed the tone of the war. It made the country realize how far the Pacific War still had to go. But also made something else clear. The Americans weren't stopping. Japan understood this. Tarawa had been built to send a message. Instead, it delivered the opposite one. The defenders expected the Marines to run. Instead, they watched them climb over a reef under machine gun fire and keep coming. They expected hesitation. They got ferocity. They expected confusion. They got adaptation. They expected to hold the island for months. They lost it in 3 days. And the final truth is the simplest. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers never left Tarawa because they chose to fight to the last man against an enemy who refused to quit. The Marines didn't run. They didn't break. They didn't turn back. They took BDO by the hardest, and they carried its lessons with them for the rest of the war. And that's the story behind the title, the weight behind the numbers, and the legacy behind one of the most brutal 76 hours in American military history.